This is the NTC Now. It's a gathering of the NatureTech Collective, a global community of people and their organizations who are working relentlessly across categories towards this nature positive future. They're the ones deploying restoration projects across grasslands, forests, or coral reefs. They're the ones crafting technology to keep track of this progress we make for these ecosystems. They're the ones creating the platforms that visualize this progress in ways that others can understand, relate to, and act on. Or they're the ones putting resources, money, to deploy this conservation and restoration. So each week on this NTC Now, we bring together these innovators, these experts, these change makers who are harnessing technology to protect and regenerate our natural world. In January, we established the foundations of nature tech, exploring what it is, how it fits into the broader landscape of sustainability and business. In February, we mapped the nature tech technology landscape, examining everything from ground truth sensors to remote sensing to AI applications, blockchain solutions. And today, we're shifting our focus to the market pressures. What's really driving this industry forward? This month, we're diving into all the frameworks, regulations, and standards, both voluntary and obligatory, that are pushing this market forward and encouraging businesses and actors in the landscape to gather and work together. Specifically today, we're addressing the Global Biodiversity Framework, which represents a pivotal shift in how countries and companies alike are being asked to address biodiversity loss. This is creating both challenges and opportunities that are shaping nature tech adoption for years to come. So today we're delighted to welcome Emily Birch from WildSight, an organization that helps teams make sense of the nature market and take their first steps into action. Emily brings valuable expertise in translating complex regulatory frameworks into practical business strategies, making her the perfect guide to help us understand how the GBF is transforming corporate approaches to nature. Okay, so before we dive into the whole subject, Emily, could you tell us about your background and the work WildSight does in helping organizations make sense of the nature positive landscape?
And hi everyone, I'm Emily Birch, the founder of WildSight, and as Paige mentions, we help companies make sense of nature and move to action. And so far we've been focusing on learning tools like bite-sized video series on things like nature tech, policies and frameworks, and investing in nature. And now we are expanding into practical tools that can support business action. So things like getting compliant with reporting frameworks and setting high-level strategy and targets. And a little bit on me and my journey. So like some of you, I'm a lifelong nature nerd, and I've spent my career at the intersection of business, tech, and nature, the three things that I love, and conveniently, the three things that come together to drive real change. So I started out advising execs and policymakers on sustainability at McKinsey and got deep into carbon markets and nature-based solutions. This led to a bunch of really interesting opportunities, including this thing called the Leaf Coalition, working to scale forest protection in a big public-private partnership. But the deeper I got, the more I wanted to get close to the ground. So to actually understand what was going on and happening and how it all worked. And I also wanted to address the supply challenge of scaling nature-based solutions. So I joined the nature tech startup, Revalue, moved to Indonesia, which is where I am now. And I spent the last 3 years or so working on designing the next gen of high integrity nature projects. But the common thread through all of this is I'm super interested and passionate about the massive potential that businesses have to drive action for nature, but also the massive barriers. So what's holding them up? And that's what pushed me to leave Revalue to focus on. And so WildSight, the company that I recently founded, exists to make it radically easier for companies to get their foot in the door and to act on nature in a really practical and simple way. So a nature positive future is one where we stop harm to nature and then actively restore it on a planetary scale. So it's not some idealistic dream state, but it's an existential imperative. And this audience, you guys will be familiar with the numbers, right? what they all point to is nature is really in crisis and our economies and lives are entirely dependent on it. And so the scale and rate of change required to reach a nature positive future is immense. We're talking about things like ending deforestation, redirecting trillions of dollars of investment from harmful activities, and restoring millions of hectares of degraded land. And so to achieve this, at the core of a nature positive future is this fundamental rethink of how we integrate the value of nature into our economic systems and decision making. So everything from like how we invest, how we design cities, how we grow food, how we run businesses, like the list goes on. And we can take the example of Costa Rica to bring this concept of integrating the value of nature to decisions to life. And this is what the nature positive future is all about. So with Costa Rica, they needed to expand their power system, which in the past has relied on hydropower, a renewable source, but one that comes with trade-offs, right? So large dams can damage river ecosystems, displace communities, and disrupt water supplies locally. And so instead of building more dams, Costa Rica took all of this into their consideration, into their decision-making process, and made a different choice. So they committed to expanding wind, solar, and geothermal energy instead. And so this approach, it meets growing energy demand, right? But without the environmental costs that they were facing with hydropower. So it's just one small example. I'm sure we'll touch on a few more as we go through. But I think it brings to life that the nature positive future, it's about stopping harm and then reversing it. And the way we get there is by integrating the value of nature into decision making. There are a lot of different things going on, but to massively simplify, there are two dynamics driving it. One, the nature crisis is becoming an economic crisis in real time. So this gets at a lot of the risks language you might be familiar with. And this is getting at things like invasive species destroying billions of dollars worth of crops. So there's this risk element and it's very real and it's happening now. And then the other thing that's happening in tandem is the private sector is starting to see that nature positive isn't just about risk, but about possibility. So for example, new revenue opportunities. There's a well-known example with Unilever that diversified to a plant-based offering and it's generated over $1.5 billion in annual sales. Other opportunities like price premiums that customers are willing to pay for nature positive products, as well as things like brand loyalty. So this is the opportunities language that you might have heard. And at the same time, there's a bunch of other great stuff that's happening and building up traction. So we're seeing institutions and organizations getting behind this. And to call out just a few, we've got the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures, bit of a mouthful, the TNFD, which is guiding businesses on disclosing these risks and opportunities. And also the Science-Based Targets Network, which is helping develop a methodology to help companies set targets for nature. So these two big risk and opportunity dynamics are at the core. I like to think of them as the real thing driving. And then on top of this, there is this evolving nature market ecosystem. I'd again come back to these two buckets of risks and opportunities. And this is the real why it's so relevant for businesses. And to elaborate a bit on the risks, businesses are coming up against things like supply chain disruption, price volatility, reputational damage, regulatory pressure, stranded assets. These are all quite big, scary terms, but there's a bunch of very real impacts today. So, Nestle has faced a 4% decline in stock price, getting called out for sourcing palm oil from deforested areas. Another mining company's stock fell nearly 20% following regulatory changes, so there's transition risk. So while these risks are very real, on the other side, and sometimes the side that's not talked about enough, is the opportunities. And so this is really why it's important for businesses to get their get their hands around this issue now. So we've just talked about the nature positive future where ecosystems are thriving, businesses are working with nature, not against it. But it can be pretty abstract, and getting to this future is incredibly hard. So it's not just about good intentions, it requires these massive shifts in how governments, businesses, and financial systems are operating. And this is where the Global Biodiversity Framework, GBF, comes in. So I like to think of it as the Paris Agreement for nature, a global action plan to stop and reverse biodiversity loss. And I can go into some of the goals if that's interesting too, but that's the
Yeah, what are
punchy
those primary goals of the
punchy
framework?
bit. Yeah, of course. So there are these two big milestones, right? 2030, 2050. By 2030, the goal here is to stop nature's decline and start recovery, so against a 2020 baseline. And then for 2050, this is getting at the recovery aspect. So the goal here is to fully restore ecosystems, species, and nature's ability to sustain economies and communities. And a key shift of what the GBF does is this whole of society approach. So it's not just governments, but it's about businesses, investors, civil society, all stepping up. And within these two buckets, the 2030 and the 2050 goal, the GBF then breaks it down into different targets. So for 2030, there are 23 very actionable, measurable targets, including things you might have heard of, right? Like the conserving 30% of land and ocean, or redirecting a certain volume of capital away from harmful subsidies. So it gives us this quantified time-bound roadmap. So the GBF has been signed on by 196 parties, which represents 195 countries and the European Union. Notably, all of the UN nation member states have ratified the GBF, except for the US, which is a slightly unusual case. And so what they are signing on for is an agreement to align national policies with the GBF's goals, and then to report on progress. So this happens in two ways. They have these things called national biodiversity, it's another huge mouthful, national biodiversity strategies and action plans, NBSAPs, where each of these countries, they have to update an action plan to align with the GBF targets. And the second thing they have to do is report. So they have to submit updates on how they're implementing, similar to what happens with NDCs and climate commitments. And just to reiterate, the reason why this is so significant and it's a real turning point for nature is it's the first time that the countries are coming together with this unified goal under a very measurable and time-bound framework. So all of these factors together is what makes it such an exciting moment in time. So this is the real question, right? How does this all become real? We've got these big, lofty goals. So the way the GBF gets mobilized is through national and regional strategies. So governments translate the targets to policies, regulations, and reporting requirements. Businesses will feel the impact either directly in instances where reporting becomes mandatory, which is something we're seeing happen in the EU, and others will be impacted indirectly. So this is more the pressures from investors as expectations shift around changing business models to become nature positive, or at least report on nature risks and opportunities. But the extent of impact for business will depend on sector and size, and some industries will need to adapt faster than others. So just to bring it to life a little bit on the direct impacts, we can take the UK's biodiversity net gain policy as an example. So this is where any new real estate development must leave nature in a better state with a 10% biodiversity gain maintained for 30 years. So for real estate, infrastructure and construction companies, this is really changing immediately and materially how they operate today. And there's also the reporting that we've touched on, right? So in the EU, they're leading on nature disclosures of risks and dependencies. And this is, again, for companies operating in these geographies, like direct impacts. And then just to bring some of the indirect impacts to life a little bit, the GBF is reshaping expectations. So for one, we've now got this common language and structure of nature-related targets. We're starting to think about what goals and metrics look like. And it's trickling down into things like investor decisions. We've seen a lot of adoption of this voluntary TNFD framework, which speaks to that. And investors are really starting to factor nature risk into decision making. You know, higher borrowing costs, lower investments, limited market access for their portfolios that aren't in alignment. So I hope that gives a bit of a sense. And then just to finish on how the impact of the GBF is not necessarily uniform across sectors. Some will feel impacts sooner than others. So agriculture, mining, infrastructure, there are already some supply chain rules, reporting requirements in place, and other sectors aren't so far behind. Yeah, or maybe before that, just to paint the broader picture and why and how this looks different across the globe. So we've got this big global mission of stopping and then reversing biodiversity loss. But the path to get there looks very different across countries and regions because the challenges aren't the same, right? Like a land scarce island nation doesn't have the same priorities as a country with loads of forest. So governments also vary in policy tools, economic structures, and political will. So some regions are turning commitments from the GBF into laws and regulation. Others are setting more voluntary schemes and targets with incentives and public-private collaboration, things like that. And then in others, the GBF commitments remain a bit of an aspiration, right? So the action plans that were submitted at the end of last year, there were some missing and there's still a bit of a lag. But just to maybe two different types of ways that countries and regions are making it real. Regulation we've spoken about with the EU and the UK. So the UK's BNG, Biodiversity Net Gain Scheme, the EU's reporting requirements. And then other examples are commitments to super large scale landscape conservation. So some call outs here, Sweden, Scotland, Singapore, South Africa, also doing really cool things. You know, Scotland's funding a lot of afforestation, Singapore, same for urban biodiversity. So they're focused on making Singapore this like green urban mecca. South Africa is prioritizing restoration of really large areas of degraded habitat. So that, I hope, also shows just the different ways that this is coming to life. And now we can go deep on the EU Pollinators Initiative if you want.
Yes, well, that's one of the ones, but that's one of the ones we prepared, so let's do it.
Cool. So this is just, yeah, one example of what an initiative like looks like in practice and how these big lofty goals become people's reality on the ground. So some context in the EU, pollinators are essential to food production. Around 80% of crops are directly dependent on animal pollination, yet the numbers, populations are declining. And this isn't just a biodiversity issue, like a nice to have, it's real and it's very economic. So nearly 4 billion euros of EU agricultural output depends directly on these pollinators. And so what the EU did is, from the GBF framework, create this initiative in alignment with different targets. So GBF target 2 is about ecosystem restoration. So it's aligned with that. And then there's a target 4 about species recovery. So you can see how this all starts like plugging together. And practically, how this initiative works is through a three-pronged approach. So the first is about improving knowledge, the second is around conserving and restoring habitats, and then the third is around mobilizing society. And so within these three blocks, there are policies popping up like incentives for farmers that adopt practices that benefit pollinators, or subsidizing moves away from harmful pesticides that are harming pollinators. We can get like super niche and technical, but that's the gist of how this stuff is coming together. And it's a nice example, right? Because it's getting at the themes that we've touched on. This initiative, it's helping value nature. So it's recognizing that pollinators are critical to economies and the food system. It's linking business and policy. And it's also engaging all stakeholders, from farmers to city planners, and showing how this change and this transition really happens at multiple levels. So it's an example, it's a bit of a test case, and there's a lot still to see how the GBF targets and framework gets mobilized in similar ways. This is a huge and important question. And so, as you guys at the NatureTech Collective have very helpfully defined, naturetech is any technology that enables, accelerates, and scales the nature positive transition. So it's about making nature visible, measurable, and valuable in decision making. And I love thinking about it through your 5M categories. So market pressures, measurement and monitoring, modeling, material change, monetization. And so how this plugs into the GBF is, we can think of naturetech as this toolkit that helps governments, businesses, and also communities deliver on the GBF goals much faster, smarter, and at a large scale. And because we've just been talking about it, the EU Pollinators Initiative, we can use that as an example, right, to think how this comes to life. So with the measuring and monitoring, we can't protect pollinators if we don't know what's happening to them. So naturetech here has a crucial role in things like smart sensor networks to track movement, bioacoustics, listen to the buzzing activity, eDNA sampling, satellites and drones to monitor land use change. And then with modeling, again, with this pollinators example, data is not enough, but the AI models can help predict landscapes most at risk, digital twin simulations, risk models to assess how pollinator decline could disrupt economies. Then we get onto this material change, and you'll see that I really do love this framework because I think it's so clear. Material change then allows us to do stuff with those insights, right? So in the pollinators example, farm management systems, regenerative ag tools, drone seeding technology, if that's needed, to restore wildflower habitats and things like that. And then you can also see how the monetization and the market pressures comes in too, right? So natural capital accounting, helping us quantify the economic value of pollinators, biodiversity credits potentially for rewarding farmer activity for restoring habitats. I could keep listing and going on, but it's really this fundamental enabler of the GBF and how to make all of this stuff happen and make it real. And I think that's kind of my reflection with all of this. The GBF is so helpful in laying out this North Star, this roadmap. We kind of know what needs to happen now. And we also know what's possible with naturetech. And so, yeah, it's a crazy exciting time because the challenge now is just to make it happen and make it happen at the speed that it needs to as well. Let's see if I can do that. Okay, so I'll give you three. One, a nature positive future. It's not just like the right thing to aim for, it's really the only future that makes sense, right? And that's always what I come back to. The alternative is an economic system that just continues to undermine itself. But while that direction is clear, the pathway is pretty complex and there's just a bunch of work to do, but it's unquestionably what needs to be done. Maybe the second thing just to bring back again is like nature tech. And I'd actually love to, I don't know if we have like an open discussion in these sections, just hear how like all the members think about nature tech in the context of the GBF. But the nature tech is the enabler that is going to make this transition to a nature positive future possible. And then third, just to end on where I just left, but the challenge is no longer figuring out what needs to get done. We can cut it in so many ways. We can say, you know, this lens of shifts, these targets, like we know what needs to be done. And so the challenge is making it happen fast enough to make a difference.
Okay, so become nature positive or implode. Spread the word about nature tech and what it is and why it's important. And let's get to it, like busy bees or busy ants. Um, Emily, thank you so much for your knowledge, for your clarity. We're going to start opening up to the Q&A in just about 1 minute. Before that, I just want to remind everyone, or thank everyone for being here. Remind everyone that this is the NTC Now, a meeting of the Nature Tech Collective, and that today we were with Emily Birch from WildSight. If you go to wildsight.com, you'll see a bunch more amazing little videos that explain these concepts very clearly. I've been using them myself, and yeah, thank you, Emily.
But the question isn't if we extract, it's just how to make that extraction regenerative rather than destructive. And I think you're right in saying that how does that work if we're still operating in the current system of economic incentives and how financial value is measured, which excludes anything to do with are you harming the orchards that you're working on or whatever it might be. And so the twist or the challenge is like, how do we apply the value of nature into that existing economic incentive system? So what would it look like if you put all of your assets of a big pharma company on the balance sheet and you actually had to financially put a value on the land you're extracting, like the risks associated with it, and then also consider the other side. I know you said that you didn't want to think about premiums, and maybe that's for like more of a philosophical thing, but how can you start seeing those financial opportunities with more regenerative models? I think what you're highlighting, which is super important, is there are always like trade-offs with these decisions. But I think that the direction and the ambition is to create a place where these things are not mutually exclusive. So yeah, so you might be able to open the copper mine, for example, but instead of it being the traditional super extractive, super destructive, there's a lot of degradation that is left behind from that mine. How could you open, run it, and close it in a much more like nature positive way? So I think of these things is like there are all of these decisions and trade-offs, and what different regions or countries prioritize will depend, as you say, on their economic and political situations. But I think the challenge to move towards is how do you make them less mutually exclusive, as you put it? Like how can you make these business models or these decisions competitive with the traditional extractive ones?